What's up, everybody? I'm really happy to have Robb Wolf with me today. And if you don't know who Robb Wolf is, I'm sorry. But this guy is a former research biochemist. Yes, a former research biochemist. But more importantly, he's best-selling author of The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat. He's got a newer book out that he's co-authored called Sacred Cow. And as many of you may or may not know, he was the first and fourth CrossFit affiliates gyms in the world, which is a pretty spectacular history, all the goods and bads of it. But just a lot of knowledge around food and health and the things that really matter in life. So, hey, Robb, welcome to the show, man.
Huge honor to be here. Thanks, man.
Yeah, it's if you know, for a guy like me who's been in the CrossFit functional fitness world, for a minute, you hear Robb Wolf and everybody's like brain just turns on. And I got to give you a big shout out. You probably know this, but I was listening to Rogan the other day, and I know you've been on with him once or more. And he just dropped your name. I'll have to talk to Robb about that. He's talking about nutrition. I thought that was the coolest thing. So I'm not sure if you heard that one, but
I did not. Nope.
Yeah, They were talking. Oh, it's awesome. I guess we could just dive in. It was Adam Curry. And he's been reading a lot about like this plant-based stuff and, the replacement of meat with these vegan patties and really the economic side of it. It goes well beyond like the health initiative. It goes well beyond the sustainability or the methane issue. It goes to the fact that it's just freaking cheaper and easier to produce. So I don't know if you've had any thought around that.
He was suggesting that the plant-based stuff was cheaper and easier to produce.
Yeah. And I couldn't necessarily get into details, but he's just talking about how it's maybe easier to reproduce and get faster to the public. I'm not quite sure, but he's a huge proponent of meat, of beef.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. So, interesting. I would need to listen to it because there've just been a couple of Forbes pieces and some other things where, so for a long time, I've been talking about these things called life cycle analyses, where they basically go in and they figure out every input, every output of a thing. So there was a life cycle analysis done on like a Prius a number of years ago, and they compared it to like a Hummer. And it was basically which one has the larger carbon footprint and over like a 10-year period of running it and whatnot. And surprisingly, the Prius doesn't pencil out well at all. And it's because that battery, like you have to mine the lithium and, all these rare earth metals in kind of remote, weird locations. And then that stuff, the ore needs to be shipped somewhere for processing. And then it basically gets shipped back and forth around the world 4, 5, 6 times. Like I forget the exact details, but ironically that Prius, if we're really wrapped around, and there's arguments for and against electric vehicles that go beyond this stuff, but if you're just going to get wrapped around the axle of like carbon emissions and carbon equivalents and all that type of stuff, the Prius doesn't pencil out well relative to a Hummer, which blows people away and they can't believe it. But this is where math, science, physics are handy because it actually tells you the truth. Not if you ask the question properly, or willing to let it take you to its endpoint, then it can give you some very counterintuitive stuff. So a lot of this plant-based, meat alternative stuff, which I always find it funny, like people who are into meat are not trying to make meat look like carrots and broccoli, but all the, like meat is supposed to be this horrible thing, but the plant-based people just can't not. They're so excited to try to replace meat, which is, supposed to be this horrible thing. So I don't know. Why don't you just eat beans and rice and call it a day? But there's some pretty good life cycle analyses that are coming up, and it doesn't look favorably on the ecological side, and just the cost, like the what arrives at the consumer. So like Impossible burgers are more than double the price of grass-fed organic filet.
Is that for the consumer or for the producer?
Both.
Really?
The consumer is that cost.
You're going to have to listen to that, because I'm feeling now like maybe I totally misheard it, but there was some sort of like financial benefit on one end for this plant-based options. So
and I mean, people say that all the time, but just at the checkout stand, it's pretty easy. Like Impossible Burger costs twice as much as like grass-fed organic filet costs per pound. So yeah.
My 17-year-old's really funny. He's really super thin, and we're working really hard with him on eating more real foods and more protein, and really kind of dialing it in. He's really focused on it, but he's just this consumer. He's part of this consumer age. He has his own car. He has his own debit card. He makes his own money. He stops by at the convenience store. Well, a couple months ago, we get home and he's already home and he's made himself some dinner. And I'm like, what are you eating? He's like, chicken nuggets. I've seen these at the store, and they're really, they're everywhere, and they taste great. And he's eating. I'm like, okay. So I'm like, let me look at the box. I'm like, dude, these are plant-based. He's like, what? I'm like, these aren't chicken. They're like called nugs or something.
Right.
We had such a good laugh, and he's like, but they're really good. Guess what? He never ate one again. They're still sick.
Oh, funny. Oh.
I don't know if it's like a psychological thing, but he knows that I absolutely love beef. I love meat. Like, it's just that's what I consume the most of. So right. I don't know if it's like, hey, I want to make my dad proud and not eat this stuff, or what it was, but it's funny because he had no clue. So they're doing a good job at this mimicking of flavor. I don't know what it takes to get there, but
a lot of good chemistry.
And I told him, hey, like, look, marketing works. Like, you saw it everywhere. There's a picture of a chicken on the front. Like, you talk about this emulating the real thing. This is crazy. Like, I put a picture of a chicken if there's no chicken in there. I just don't understand it. So anyway, just let's move this into something that might be really interesting for the listeners, and that's food and your kids. That's something I really want to talk to you about, because I don't know how much of I'd love to say you're a pioneer in this movement. I really think you are, in kind of the paleo eating. And
pioneers get the arrows, so I would agree with that. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm always curious how folks like you, who have written books and are well known, and how do you take this knowledge and belief in what you believe? And by the way, I'm 100% behind you. I've really refocused my eating this way, and that's when I'm functioning at my absolute best. And we can go down that road in a bit, but that's when I'm sleeping better. I feel better. I'm healthier. I don't get headaches. I mean, we just go on and on. But we also talked about in another podcast I did with you about, like, I had ulcerative colitis, and those things just go away when I'm eating in the way that you kind of preach. But just really, how is this applicable in the life cycle of raising kids? Your kids are
7 and 9.
7 and 9. So still pretty moldable. But I imagine there's a lot that you did early on to kind of raise them up in this environment. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. And it's funny, like, for the people who are like the paleo or food elitists, they're going to be horrified that, like, I'm as lax as I am. And then for people who live like cockroaches, they're going to think that I'm an absolute Nazi, horrible parent, CP. Yeah. So nobody is going to be happy on this, which tells me that I'm probably doing pretty close to the right thing. Like, so long as I piss everybody off, then I'm like, good. My job is done. So, I mean, let's just start early. My wife had our first daughter, and, we were able to breastfeed-ish. Like, we didn't get a good latch, and so my wife pumped for over a year because she's a saint, and we traveled and did all kinds of stuff with this fucking pump in tow, and like it was really something else. But then we started facing the introduction of real foods, and so I have celiac disease. I have this gluten intolerance that is an absolute no-go. And I've also just seen so many people, I mean, thousands of people with kids with different gut issues, ADHD issues, behavior issues, health issues, that when they clean things up and they move towards this kind of paleo-esque way of eating, that they did really, really well. Like, they went from feeling terrible, acting terrible, whatever, and they do kind of a qualitative shift, and there's magic. So I was pretty bought in. I'm like, okay, well, I want to do something like this, but I'm going to have to figure out like the balance with all this stuff. So I think the first solid food that we gave our kid to chew on and like the baby led weaning stuff was bacon. So, and she loved it. And then, it was like
in the world to start with.
Yeah. And it was meat and fruits, a little bit of veggies, but funny enough, the kids are not huge fans of veggies. And I think that that's kind of it's almost like cigars and dark chocolate. Like you have to develop a taste for that stuff later. Like it's not something that's just kind of, inherent to you. And we do, our kids eat probably a little bit on the lower carb side just because we don't do a ton of junk. Like we never went down like the goldfish route and all that just kind of crap food, because what my second book, Wired to Eat, talks about the neuroregulation of appetite. And I know for a fact that people get highly habituated to particular types of food, like steak and broccoli and a cheese sauce and all that can taste amazing, or it can taste like cardboard if you're used to eating stuff that's out of a box or a bag and has been engineered to be hyper palatable and taste totally amazing. And so by and large, I wanted to get the kids comfortable with eating whole, real food. And I think so far it's been good. Like only one kid has needed antibiotics once in the time that they've been around. And when I was a kid, by the time I was 9 years old, I can't tell you how many times I had strep throat and this and that. I was on a conveyor belt of antibiotics. And I think that was part of the problem with me ultimately developing ulcerative colitis, was both the diet and I was, constant antibiotic use. I ended up developing acne, which is mainly driven by dairy consumption. So I didn't know that in my teenage years, and you don't want to walk around looking like a pizza. And so you do Accutane and tetracycline. I was on tetracycline for acne between the age of 13 and 24, 25, thereabouts, so no wonder that my guts are pretty hammered. But, fast forward, we have a gluten-free house because I'm super reactive to it. And I just see there's nothing in gluten that you can't get from, gluten containing things that you can't get from rice or potatoes or sweet potatoes or what have you. It's cool for making bread because it has this, cool consistency to stick together, but there's decent alternatives. And so as we've motored forward, I'm trying to think, big picture, like one thing that I've done is try to set the kids up so that they can self-regulate with what they go get. So we get these Lily's dark chocolates, and some of them are dark, some are like 55%. They're kind of the lighter end. And then my wife and I get like the 75, 80% stuff. And it is sugar-free. It's stevia sweetened. And I just have those in a drawer in the kitchen, and the kids can self-regulate on that. Like they can eat whatever they want to on that. And what I think is fascinating about that is the kids really like it, but they'll go break off a square and they'll chew on it and they'll motor around and then they're done. Whereas like when Halloween hits and they do a Snickers or they do a Twix or they do a Reese's peanut butter cup, they'll like after Halloween, we found candy wrappers like hidden under the pillows of their bed. And this is where we're like, okay, do you guys see what you're doing here? Like this stuff is so addictive that you're hiding it and sneaking in the bedroom. And I just talk to them like adults. I'm like, listen, there's going to come a day where I will not be in your life. Either I'll be dead or you'll be grown up and moved away and doing your own thing or, whatever. And you are going to be tasked with making good decisions, hopefully. And you have to understand, like, why is it that Lily's chocolate, I'll ask them. I try to do a lot of Socratic method. I try not to talk at them. I try to ask a lot of questions and kind of draw them out. So what's the deal with this Lily's? Is it good? They're like, yeah, it's good. What about these other things? They're really good. Okay. They are really good. Are they so good? Can you turn them off? And they're like, no, I can't. I'm like, okay, so what do we do about that? And it's like, well, maybe we don't always have them around, and they come up with great decisions, great responses to it. And so, if we go to a friend's birthday and there's like gluten cupcakes or whatever, and my oldest daughter does react to gluten, so it's not just me. Like she gets kind of a tick, so she doesn't get gut issues. She gets a neurological response, and
that's interesting.
And she just for hours, and like you'll remind her, you're like, hey Zoe, what are you doing? She'll stop for like 30 seconds. And so it's this kind of weird ADHD kind of tick thing. And I, thinking back, I remember, shit, I used to do that as a kid. I didn't start off with gut issues. So neurological stuff is one of the first things that happens with celiac disease. So I just make my daughter aware of it. I'm like, well, Zoe, this is a thing. And I went from right now, like they can eat out. And if they get some French fries that are cooked in a fryer that has gluten in it, they don't react to that. She doesn't get this tick deal. But I told her, I'm like, what I'm worried about is if you eat gluten all the time, you're going to get to where I am, where you can't eat. It's hard to eat out. It's hard to do anything. It makes this stuff really difficult. So I don't lambast her. I don't make her feel bad for it. I lay out these options. I'm like, here's the reality of our world, and we can make decisions about how we navigate this. So I try to put out options for them. So like my wife's been on a Thai food kick lately. She's been making green curry and chicken satay and all this stuff. So we went to the Asian market, and I got these little sesame honey wafers, and they're amazing. Like I love these things. Just awesome mouth feel, they crunch and all that. And I bought several of these. I knew the kids would like them, and the youngest really, really liked them. Like to the tune that the other night I watched her. She went over, opened the package, ate one, squirreled around, played some piano, came back over, opened another package, ate another. And I didn't say anything, but then at dinner, I'm like, hey kiddo, how many of those things did you have? And she was like, I'm not even sure. I'm like, yeah, because you went on this autopilot deal and you weren't even aware of what you were eating. You were just eating. I'm like, that's a problem. The people who pay us a lot of money to help them lose weight or change their lives, they end up in this situation. So all I'm asking you to do is leave them in the cabinet. And when you get one down, I want you to like mark it in your piano book that you got one. And all that I want you to do is be aware of what you're doing. I don't want you to be on autopilot. She's like, and she's 7 years old, mind you. She's like, okay. So I didn't like beat her down. I didn't, oh, you're a horrible person, you're going to get fat. Like, I don't talk about weight or body composition at all. The only thing that I mention around that stuff is I asked them, do you like being the tallest kids in all of your jiu-jitsu classes by your age and everything? Like, yeah, like they're super tall. My 9-year-old is 5 feet tall. And wow. So I'm 5'9". Everybody in my side of the family was the shortest person other than myself was my dad, who was 6'3". Like I have half. Yeah. So I think they're going to be really tall. Yeah. They're not going to be gymnasts. They're going to be volleyball players probably. So that's the only thing I don't talk about. I mentioned that other people have weight issues and have health issues related to their weight and all that stuff. But so I'm trying to thread this needle of not creating food issues, disordered eating and all the rest of this stuff. So I focus on like, do you like being strong? Do you like being able to climb ropes and go to jujitsu and go snowboarding and all this stuff? I'm like, yeah. So I make it very performance oriented. One thing that I really learned early on running our CrossFit gym, and the cool thing about CrossFit is that because it's performance oriented, I almost never had women who ended up with disordered eating because you write the name on the board and then you come in dead last and you will kill someone to change that outcome. And so if somebody's been at the top of the leaderboard and then they start falling, I'm like, what's going on with you? And they're like, oh, I've been skipping meals. I'm like, why are you doing that? Well, I want to lean out. Well, we can lean you out, but like your performance sucks. Do you want like Charlene to continue to kick your ass in here? And they're like, fuck that, And so this performance orientation, if you, what is it? A form follows function.
Yep.
If you focus on performance, like I want to be a kick-ass, middle distance runner or gymnast or whatever. If you focus on that, then everything else just plays out, and you take on the form of that middle distance runner, whatever that stuff is. So I really try to focus on, getting them excited about being able to do things, not like, well, you need to watch your weight, and we don't even talk about that stuff. So, I don't know. I know I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit, but it's that's kind of the general thing. And I just talk to them a lot. And here's something that I say all the time. I don't know what the right answer is to this. I'm guessing, but here's what my thinking is. And I talk to them and walk them through that stuff. And it takes time, and I have to be present. Like I'm fortunate that I've created an environment where I have some time to be present for them. And, we're driving to jujitsu and different things, and I'll talk to them about different things like this. But I also kids really pick up on emotionality, and I just try not to be aggro about this stuff. I'm like, hey, you, and also I really couch it in, someday I'm not going to be here to tell you all the things, and I'm going to give you some advice, but you can nod your head now, and, and when you're out doing your own thing, you'd be like, well, fuck you, old man. And it's like, okay, cool. That's on you. That's fine. That's an option, but, I'm just trying to give you guys some awareness so that and I think that they pick up on that. Like, they get the sincerity. And the thing is I'm not trying to control them. I'm really not trying to control specific behaviors. I'm trying to give them a sense of, here are consequences based on what you're doing. And do you like that or not? And so
I really like that approach.
Yeah. I feel like it gives them little to push back against. They're not picking up on like some, hyped up emotionality on my part where it either scares them or it makes them like, ooh, I got to rise out of the old man. So I'm going to do this, and so that's where we're at. And they're 7 and 9, and I don't know where that's all going to finish. It is worth noting that, so like Friday nights, we do a family pizza night, and it's gluten-free pizza. And my wife usually gets like the Udi's pizza crusts and, makes them into really, really good. And it's about 2 years ago that both girls separately came up to me, and they were like, hey, Dad, can you guys cook like some chicken or some hamburger on pizza nights too? When I don't have any protein at all, I don't feel good afterwards.
Whoa.
Sure. Yeah. So that was super powerful. Like they, and what was interesting to me about that is they generally feel so good that even though they love the pizza, they really love the pizza, but Zoe, my oldest, was like, I just feel like if I have some chicken or some hamburger or something with it, like I just feel better. I'm like, well, of course you do. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm like, that, if that is the way that she handles the rest of her eating throughout her life, where she's like, oh, I felt like shit after that, I need more protein with it. So I'm just balanced. I'm done. I succeeded as a parent right there. Yeah.
Well, I like the approach of this conversation with them. It's a conversation. You're asking questions. You're asking them to evaluate and look at things at a different level, asking them what was the outcome and why do you think it went this way? Because that not only teaches them around nutrition, it just teaches them about life. Another thing that I found really beneficial is just telling them my story of like what it does for me. It may be different for you. My wife is very fit, and she has learned over time. We're in our upper 40s. She's learned over time that at this point she does function better when she's eating more natural foods. She can, and I kid you not, she can eat Cheez-Its and crackers and cheddar cheese all day long and stay at like a 8% body fat and function like crazy. It's just a genetic difference, right? So in this environment that we raised our kids, I was clueless about nutrition. That's how she was raised, and it always worked for her at some level. And now we have these teenagers, and we're both much more dialed in. And so we're kind of having to pull in rope, but I found it very useful to not like just take it away, but ask questions like you've mentioned. I've noticed that when I go without sugar for a solid amount of time, I can't have hardly anything, and I get an intense headache immediately. And I notice that I get incredibly agitated, and then I fall asleep. I mean, it's insane.
Right.
And I've kind of started to see this pattern with my 13-year-old, and just he'll get snarky and irritable. And so instead of saying, hey, don't eat that, this is what I've noticed. I'm like, how do you feel after you have a bunch of Oreos? And he'll just sit there and he'll think and he'll talk. I'm like, okay, just something to keep in mind. Now, I'm not going to take the Oreos away. Like that's not how life works. I found that, and you also talked about this thoughtless eating. I'm 48 and my wife just pointed out to me last week in a very loving way. She's like, because I'm totally cutting out like just chips. And I just thought, oh, I'm just having a few. She goes, no. Like you think you're just having a few, but you're not even thinking. You're just grabbing and eating. We'll sit there and talk for 20 minutes. And I'm like, what? She's like, yeah. Like, so there's just a lot of learning that has to be redone over time. Right. And if we can get to them younger and understand the impact and maybe the consequences, not the consequences, but the what happens when we do X, and just let them simmer on it, let them learn and see it. So I think that's awesome. You also mentioned Lily's chocolate. It's amazing. If I have chocolate chips in the cabinet, I could eat them all. I have Lily's chocolate. I do it in the chocolate chip format, like the same thing, like the dark stuff. I'll grab like 5 when I'm feeling like I need a sweet tooth, and that's all I need. It's insane how different that the chemicals or whatever in sugar creates this sensation of you can't stop.
Yeah. And that's, people are usually kind of aware of that, but it's, there are these, I hate the term hack, like the whole biohacking thing. It just kills me, but it is kind of a hack where it's like, okay, you're still having chocolate, but this chocolate tastes good, but it doesn't taste so good that it's like you're selling your body on the street to pay for purchasing more, where it takes on addictive substance type characteristics. And like you made a good point for folks with older kids, it's just tougher. Like if you've got years or just years of inertia with kind of subpar eating, like you can always change, you can always begin riding the boat. A lot of what I've found is helpful is focusing on addition, not removal. So it's like, hey, just make sure you get adequate protein. Well, why do I need protein? Yeah. Well, kids are always into something. Gaming, athletics, piano, horseback riding, whatever. They're typically into something. It's like, well, if you want to be more on point with your gaming, then your neurotransmitters are going to work better when you've got some protein. So have some of that before or with the other stuff you have. And lo and behold, kids, if they will tinker with that, they do notice they feel better. You're not specifically trying to remove an item. Like that can kind of come later. It's like, hey, if you want to, like, if your gut hurts every time you have a regular sandwich, maybe we have rice or sweet potatoes or something, and they try it. And they're like, oh, okay. And I like those. And you do it, so you can tinker with that. But instead of focusing on the removal, focus on the addition of, better options. And really the better option, I think out of all that is protein. And if that boils down to like jerky or meat sticks or good quality cheese or whatever, like focus on that, because that is really the thing that's going to stick with folks. And if people undereat protein, they will overeat everything else. And it always happens. And if you eat adequate protein, it's almost impossible to get people to overeat all the other stuff. Like at Mexican food, if a fajita platter came out first, and even if we only had like one corn tortilla to use with it, so not a lot of carbs, but mainly like meat and veggies, maybe one corn tortilla, and then the chips came out, you'd pick at the chips, you'd have a couple of them, but you're not going to, when you were talking about eating the chips, like when that's the first thing there and you've got a beer or a margarita, like, how many of those baskets can you dust between 2 people? Like
a lot.
2, 3 of them. Like but if you ate all the protein first, I guarantee you that by the time you then get to, and then they brought the chips out, you're not going to eat as many. So this is just kind of prioritizing protein. And I think that works for the whole family as a strategy. And so if the complexity is pay attention to how you feel, like what the results are of what you're doing, and let's try to eat more protein at meals and snacks, that's not a real complex story to tell. And we're not taking shit away. We're not, there may be reasons for doing that. And, that gets all complex and everything. But I think that that's a pretty damn good first whistle stop in improving the nutritional background of a family.
Yeah, man, this hits home. So for me recently, and I've been talking through this with the kids, it's some blood work. It was funky, just one thing, trying to nail it down. So I started tracking. Every time I start tracking food, I kind of hate that thing because it kind of does something with your brain and it's hard to sustain. But I always do that to kind of get back on a baseline.
Mm-hmm.
And I just tell my wife, I'm like, okay, it's super easy for me to consume 2,200 calories in a day. Super easy. But when I focus on like hitting my protein goal for the day, if I'm tracking, I have a protein goal because I want to reset how I should be eating.
Right.
And don't eat, complex ingredient foods unless I put single ingredients together. It's kind of a very easy way for me to think about it. It's
right.
Like, I have a hell of a time getting like 1,800 calories.
Yeah.
It's not.
And you're not hungry.
I'm like, I'm at dinner. I'm like, Kim, I'm just not even hungry.
Right.
And that tells you right there, the nutritional sustenance that is occurring because prioritizing real food and protein for me is like, to use the word you hate, it's a hack.
Mm-hmm.
And, but I found that talking through that and having those conversations with my wife in front of my kids, like saying, man, this is what I've noticed. Even if I thought about it earlier, I want them to hear so that there's some connections that can start to be made, right? I heard you in a podcast recently. I don't think it was a recent podcast, but I was listening to you and Andy Stump talk. And I think you were talking about drinking calories. And I really liked that conversation because I think this is another thing. As soon as I listened to that, I went to my 17-year-old son and said, hey, I've noticed you bringing home a lot of sodas. He's autonomous. He's got his car. He's got his debit card.
Right.
I'm like, let's look at how much that's cost you. What do you think? And he's like, and he kind of calculated ahead. He's like, oh crap. I'm like, yeah, like you do a lot of hard work and that's what you're spending your money on. It seems so cheap at each balance. But then I'm like I was listening to, this guy I know, Robb, talk about this. And so we had a conversation about it. So tell me, I mean, I'm not sure if you can recall that conversation. Doesn't really matter. But let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the focus on protein is kind of one of my biggies, and the no or minimal liquid calories is another one, and it's like juice is not good for your kids. Oh. It's just not, and it particularly in the way that people consume it. When you look at the containers that people drank juice in like the 1950s. It was like a shot glass. It was like a Burley shot glass, Mm-hmm. If you want to have orange and apple juice in a Burley shot glass and that's your serving, fine. But people are having juice in like 30-ounce containers and they're getting 30-ounce container. It's like over 100 grams of sugar. Like it is like having 3 Coca-Colas, and people are like, well, it's juice. It's better. It's like, no, it is no different. Like, it's just no different. Like, nobody sits there to get 100 grams of carbs from an orange. You would need to sit down and eat 5 oranges back to back. Who other than like a gorilla does that? Like nobody does that. And then you still have the fiber and the vitamins and the minerals and the fact that it took you 30 or 40 minutes to eat those 5, versus like you're just sipping on it and you can burn right through that thing in no time. So, there's a lot of back and forth out in like the evidence-based nutrition world where people will say, if you don't overeat, then sugar doesn't matter. And I think there's some truth to that. The tough thing is that, free living people tend to overeat. It's like, well, there's the chips and here's this and here's that. But there are people, I think that they're mainly fitness competitors. I think that they all have wardrobes made out of human skins hanging in a hidden closet somewhere, but they're able to like eat half of a Twinkie and quarter of a donut, and they eat their protein, they do this, and they look good. And, then at some point we discovered that they're axe murderers and stuff like that. But but liquid sugar legitimately has an effect on our metabolism that's super bad. When we were growing up, there were two types of diabetes. There was adult onset and there was childhood diabetes. And childhood diabetes is not an immune condition. Today, there are children as young as 18 months old that have what we would call adult onset diabetes, insulin resistant diabetes, which is caused mainly from these liquid carbohydrates. And what's happening there is people are feeding their kids huge amounts of sugar, mainly in the form of juices and sodas and stuff like that, and all these other hyperpalatable foods. And it's giving these kids what's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's turning their liver into a chunk of Crisco, basically. And adult onset diabetes in children and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease was unheard of, unknown 20 years ago in kids. Like, it did not exist. And it is now the leading cause of liver transplant need in children in the developed world. And so, people can kind of dismiss it and they're like, oh, little Jimmy, he did 35 minutes of soccer and he needs his giant Gatorade or his big gulp. No, little Jimmy does not. This is one point that I'll actually get a little bit fired up about. And I'm like, you fuckers need to put your thinking cap on, because you're murdering your kids, feeding them liquid carbohydrates. Here's my crazy suggestion on all that stuff is have your kids do diet soda. And this is where the hippies then freak out. They're like, oh my God, the artificial sweeteners. And it's like, I'm a biochemist, I'm a toxicologist. Those things are not bad generally. And they're certainly not bad compared to feeding your kids massive amounts of sugar. Like, they're just not. And we always keep Zevia stocked in our refrigerator. Awesome. It's a stevia sweetened soda. And, here and there, like when we go out to eat, generally our kids just have water. But once or twice they've been at places where they're like, can I have some of that? And it's like a soda. I'm like, sure. And they'll have it and they're like, this really isn't that good. Like, they've kind of habituated to the Zevia stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, yeah, this thing has a massive amount of sugar and it's bad for your teeth and it's bad, and so I kind of go through that. So even on that, like, beverage front, I think the kids are kind of savvy to, like, here's a good way to do it. Here's not a good way to do it. If we're on an airplane or something like that, then, the stewardess comes around and like, yeah, get an apple juice, get an orange juice. And it's a big deal for them. Like, the kids really like it. And I'm not going to fight over that one. Like, they're suffering through TSA and being on an airplane and all that stuff already. So yeah, you can have that, but it's not something that we just regularly stock in the house. But that liquid carbohydrate is a big, big, big deal. And I think that the way that you win that is just like, dude, for the love of God, just do a diet soda. Like, get the same flavor and do a diet version of it, It's so interesting you say that, because I was feeling a little guilty, but I didn't know how else to kind of bridge the gap from drinking a lot of soda to none. I'm like, we talk about like, and we'll talk a little bit about Element, but we talk to our kids about, getting the right kind of hydration. And, mm-hmm. And we also villainize like Gatorade and stuff, because it's like hand them out like candy. I'm like, that's like a soda. Like, right.
Don't do that before a game. That is not what you need. So I told him, I'm like, he loves Sprite. I'm like, there's a Sprite free or whatever that's zero sugar, or Sprite Zero. And he loves Dr. Pepper. I'm like, there's Dr. Pepper Zero. They're not the best thing in the world, but I want you to focus in on switching. And he has. And he's like, it's not that bad. I'm like, I know. But I do find him, even at the age they're at, I have, your product Element in the cabinet, and it's prominent. We have a door pantry, and it's hanging on the door. So it's right there, because I do one every day. I mix a thing. And then if I mountain bike, I take some more. But he's like, so what should I do? I'm going to be working out. I'm just like, grab one of those. And he'll just do it because he thinks it's better. And it it is.
Right.
And so I'm really happy to hear that, because there was a little bit of guilt in me, but I'm like, I just don't want him drinking this 42 ounce Dr. Pepper. I mean, I live in Texas, and it's sweet tea, Dr. Pepper, Coca-Cola. And
right.
it's like, go ahead and slap a diabetes shirt on right now. It's
right. Right.
So,
yeah. Yeah. And, the irony there is if you took the sweet tea and just used stevia or, sweetener of your choice, or artificial sweetener of your choice, like, and it's so weird to me, like, people will be like, well, those artificial sweeteners are chemicals. Yes, they are. There's chemicals in everything. Like, and this is me being a chemist and kind of a dick, where it's like, there's matter and energy. If it's matter, it's made out of chemicals.
You say natural things are chemical compounds.
Yeah. I mean, arsenic is natural. Lead is natural, and they will kill you. Cyanide is natural, and it will kill you. So being natural doesn't, that's a meaningless statement, or it really needs some context. But this is where we have to reverse engineer some things and just, do we need massive amounts of sugar? No. Do we need super simple calories in this world that we live in? No. There was a report, it was sugarcane workers in like South and Central America, and they were giving these folks this like sugarcane water. It's before it gets it's when they're processing the sugarcane, like it gets juice. So they give these guys this sugar water, and it gives them lots of energy. They like it. It tastes good. And these guys in their 20s are dying of kidney failure.
Wow.
Their kidneys are just, they have non-alcoholic. The interesting thing is these guys are lean. They carry, if they carry weight, it's right in their gut, because they get that visceral adiposity, and they're dying of kidney failure because of the massive amount of sugar and the inflammation that comes about from that and everything. They're working their asses off. Like they need 5,000 calories a day to sustain the work output they're doing. And the sugarcane operations are like, well, yeah, they just hook this stuff up with spigots. It's like, as long as these guys keep working, we'll just give it to them. Like it's literally dirt cheap. The crazy thing though is these guys are dying in their 20s and 30s from stuff that we usually only see in people in their like 60s, 70s, 80s, and even then in people that didn't live a good life. Like they ate poorly, maybe they smoked, they drank a lot of alcohol, and then you end up with these liver and kidney issues. And these folks are developing it in their 20s, and it's from eating, consuming these massive amounts of liquid sugar.
That's crazy. I think it's a really good way to kind of think about the impact. I mean, if they're dying in their 20s and 30s, that's insane. I mean,
right.
And quite honestly, it's not much different than the kids stopping off at the Quickie Mart and grabbing, the ultra super huge drink or whatever it's called.
No, it qualitatively, it's not, know, and I mean, the difference there is these sugarcane workers are working their asses off, whereas generally our kids are not, certainly not at the same magnitude. Yeah. But even there, like the folks who are of the opinion, I train a lot, or I do a lot of physical activity, so I'll just burn it off. That liquid carbohydrate is a different animal. And the evidence-based nutrition folks have pushed back on pieces of this, but I think the reality is that it's kind of one thing if you're eating like a croissant or a bagel or something, like it's not necessarily good for you, but it's not hitting your system with the same speed that liquid carbohydrates do. When you dump liquid carbohydrates into the liver, like some really bad things happen. And I think that science is getting better and better established and more compelling. And then when we just step back and look at the world at large, like you said, like in the South, like sweet tea, sodas, that's the deal. I remember my grandmother would take milk and then break up cornbread and put in there, and then put sugar in that and eat that. And it was delicious, but holy smokes, man.
Not good for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. One more topic I'm curious about, because when we're trying to talk to our kids about getting enough protein, and I've had a lot of parents, I've seen a lot of conversation about this, is about liquid forms of protein. And, I've leaned on that a lot, and I pay really close attention to my hunger level, because I know it's not going to cause me satiety. it's going to leave me feeling the same way when I started. I'm going to chug 30 grams of protein and then feel like I'm full. No. What is your view on that, especially for kids who are in sports and, we're talking about, bulking or at least growing some muscle on their body, or giving them the protein so that they can, because it's hard to eat real food, enough protein in a day.
It is, or it can be. Some of the things that we do is we'll fix more than one protein source. So like for breakfast today, I fixed some hamburgers, and I did a 50-50 mix of local beef that we have and local bison that we got. We got a whole cow, we got a whole bison, and then I mixed that stuff, and the family likes it. So I cooked those, and then I cooked a bunch of shrimp. And so one of the things that I mentioned in Wired to Eat is to minimize how much food people eat, make meals simpler. So don't have multiple flavor experiences. Don't create a buffet for your dining experience. But let's say we were just talking about protein, and we had like magically one wall of our kitchen opened up, and it was like this amazing buffet that mainly focused on protein. Like it had crab and lobster and shrimp and beef and pork and lamb and all these different iterations. Would it be hard to hit your protein level? No, because you've got all these options. You grab a little bit of beef and a little bit of shrimp, a little bit of crab, and like, oh man, there's 50 grams of protein. It'd be easy. So when we're trying to keep people from overeating, then we don't necessarily want every meal to be like a buffet, but we can tweak a little bit of that understanding to our benefit. And so for my kids, I usually try to have like 2 protein options at a given meal. So it may literally be like hot dogs and Kerrygold cheese, and so maybe not even the best options, but it's 2 options. And the kids will always eat more of that protein if I've got 2 things there versus expecting them to eat a double portion of one. So that is a thing that I do, is trying to get a little more variety there. For folks that do a reset for part of our Healthy Rebellion community, what we recommend is cook more than, cook 2 or 3 proteins and then do smaller portions of each one, but it adds up to like your 40 or 50 grams or whatever. The liquid calories, if somebody's really going for it, like they've got a really compelling story, they're really trying to, pack some weight on. You've got some kid who, has some legit potential to, they almost made varsity football their freshman year or something. And like, you for sure want to like stack the deck so they do really well sophomore year or something. Okay, we'll stick in like a peri-workout shake or maybe an additional shake. But I find that people just default to that immediately. And then it's just like, then the garbage starts coming in, and then, okay, the kid gets huge, but he gains 10 pounds of muscle and 30 pounds of fat, and he's slower, and actually he's really strong, but he's less powerful. And all of athletics other than powerlifting is actually about like, what type of force can you generate relative to your body? Right. So like, in football, my friend John Wellborn played 10 years in the NFL. He is 6'5" at his peak. He was 315 pounds at 8% body fat. And he had like a 4.640 or something. Wow. Like he could move like a freight train. Yeah. And versus what ends up happening is we get high school kids to 300 pounds and they're 40% body fat and they're slow. Like if they're able to get their mitts on you, sure, they can cause some damage, but they're super slow because their power to weight ratio sucks. So we didn't do that kid any favors. And this is some of the stuff where, okay, maybe little Jimmy, like you've got to take a multi-year thing. It's like little Jimmy might actually be big Jimmy at some point, and he could play college and maybe even some professional football. So do we want him to peak in high school, or do we want him to start peaking in college? And so then you have to have a really good discussion around like, well, what is the goal? Like, do we make him a huge fat kid that he now has metabolic and body composition issues and is going to hamper him? Or do we have a game plan of adding 10 pounds a year of muscle mass and like 1 pound a year of fat mass so that he becomes an absolute, like, fire breathing animal by the time he's like, college sophomore, and pro teams are sniffing around the person. So I and that's hard decisions to make. Like, people want everything now, but these are some of the things that I so the kid wants to gain some muscle mass. Great. Okay. Well, smart strength training, not doing too much cardio. They need to sleep also. So if they're staying up all hours of the night, that's not really going to help them. So maybe there's a case for a shake in there somewhere, but I really want some good context, because otherwise we're just going to make the kid fat. Like, if I want to make somebody fat, what do? I give them liquid calories. And so we need to be really targeted and on point with how we do that stuff. It's the things that I do for my overweight middle-aged folks are just kind of in reverse for the younger kids that maybe want to gain weight. We employ the buffet strategy. Maybe we do some liquid calories, but we have to remember that, well, I don't do the liquid calories in old sedentary people because it makes them fat. So we need to use it in a targeted and smart, way with the shakes.
I think that's a really good analysis, a really good way to look at it. I think it's a lot more complicated than I'm just going to beef them up.
Right.
I think that's your message. I'm not sure if you have time, because we're knocking out.
Yeah, I've got a couple more minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Because I want to give you an opportunity to talk about Element, because this is a new thing in my life, and I like it, but I think a lot of people misunderstand it or don't know about it. Probably don't know about it. So I want you to kind of tell us what it is. You don't need to necessarily tell a story behind it, which is actually an awesome story, but why Element over other things? So this, for those of you who don't know, it's a drink mix. It's powder. It's definitely salty. I'm in love with watermelon, and then now my newfound love is the raspberry one. So
yep.
I'm bouncing around on these and I love them. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an electrolyte product that has a gram of sodium, 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. And like you said, there's kind of an interesting backstory to how we developed it. The short part of that is I had no designs on being like a salt mogul, and then we found this need for additional electrolytes, particularly sodium, within the populations we were serving. We released a how to make it yourself homebrew guide. And within 6 months of releasing that, we had 500,000 downloads of it. And so we're like, wow, this is really addressing a huge need. And then the people that had downloaded this guide, made the homebrew, they were like, why don't you guys do some sort of a stick pack deal, a convenience thing? And that's how the whole company came to be. And it's just every single action of life, every muscle contraction, every nerve impulse is driven by sodium potassium pumps. It's the way that ATP, the way that energy is produced in our body. And so if we are off on those levels, we will feel tired and lethargic and have brain fade and brain fog. And at more extreme levels, we get cramping. At very extreme levels, people can be hospitalized or die from electrolyte imbalances. And a classic example of this is the ultra marathoner who is drinking plain water at every station, and it's kind of a warm day, so that individual is sweating a lot, and they get midway through the race and they start getting really like out of their head, and they're not running out of carbohydrate, they're not running out of energy, their body can't function because the sodium is depleted, and they can get cerebral edema, brain swelling, and they can die from that. So that's all the really extreme stuff, but more germane to day-to-day stuff for like families. Ironically, most people are kind of sodium deficient, particularly if they are eating well. If you're eating a super processed diet, then you're probably getting enough sodium because processed foods tend to have a lot of sodium. But the ironic thing that happens is when people shift to a minimally processed diet, they tend to remove the bulk of the sodium sources. Then they're not doing things like eating pickles and olives and sardines and salami and stuff like that are really good sodium sources. So they do need to bump up their sodium intake. And an easy way to do that is something like Element.
Yeah. And it's yummy. I mean,
it tastes good.
When I first started it, I was like, whoa, that's salty. And now I'm like, why did I think that was salty? So it didn't take me hardly long at all, and adapted. And I really enjoy it. And I think it's awesome. I remember reading Can't Hurt Me, and David Goggins was talking about just like downing a ton of salt tablets and like putting it in pockets. So this is just a more palatable way of getting the salt that you need.
Yeah.
It's been a thing for a while. And then you told a story about, I think it was, well, golly, I could be mixing stories, but your own need for salt use or sodium use in like your jiu-jitsu, and you were experiencing a crash or some issues around that, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. And for health issues, I eat a pretty low carb diet because it helps to manage my ulcerative colitis and some of the gut issues that I have. But it's hard to do really glycolytic, like high intensity activity, like wrestling or Thai boxing or CrossFit on a lower carb diet. Particularly if you don't have adequate sodium. What's interesting is in a low carb environment, if you add significant amounts of sodium, it's not a 1-to-1 swap out like doing a higher carb diet, but it's maybe 80%. So like I got a whole bunch of that low gear, that grind back when I properly addressed my sodium intake. So, a real center of the bullseye, person for someone that would benefit from Element is like a low carb or lower carb fueled athlete. But then what we find is everybody, particularly if they're athletic, they end up being sodium depleted. Like the American Council of Sports Medicine has recommendations between 7 to 10 grams of sodium per day for athletes in hot, humid environments, as an example. You live in Texas. I do jujitsu and wear gi, so it's hot and humid every day for both of us, you know, and so it's actually a lot more situations where it's appropriate to think about like, oh, I'm probably sodium depleted, and it's super easy. You mix something like this up, or like you make the home brew and you sip on it, or you just go grab some pickle juice and do like 4 ounces of it and shoot it down. 10 minutes later, you're like, oh, I feel way better. Like your brain is just kind of firing on all cylinders. You were sodium depleted prior to that. And so your neurotransmitters don't work properly, your nerve impulses, muscle contractions, none of that stuff works well. And the kind of cool thing is that sodium is absorbed very, very quickly. So it's not like you need to wait a day or a week or a month. It's not some subtle thing where it's like, yeah, I think I'm feeling better. It's, 10 minutes later, you feel markedly better. And that's part of the reason why Element has been so successful. I think it's one of the fastest growing health and wellness companies in the world right now.
Wow,
and it's because there's this immediate, it's amazing. It's, someone feels horrible, they try Element, or they drink pickle juice at our recommendation. They feel better, and they're like, oh, those guys actually know what they're talking about. And then you buy some credibility with folks because you give them good advice. And it's like, well, if this is your problem, then here's the solution. And if that doesn't work, then we've got some other, thing that we'll play with. Yeah.
That's awesome. I kind of like the scientific approach, one variable at a time. Right. So I'm really excited when I'm feeling a little better now that I've gotten my carbs are way down because of the way I'm needing to eat. Mountain biking, I'm going to add that to it and kind of play with that. And I know, because I've been a little lagging on the mountain biking endurance, and like my legs don't spin as fast. It's just not
right.
Something's not there. So I'm really looking forward to kind of placing it in that environment. Cause I think it's going to work. So I know it will a little bit at least, but
right.
Yeah. So I'm really pumped, and I love the product, and I highly recommend, because a lot of people that listen to this are very active. It's kind of part of the listenership seems to be people who are pursuing health and fitness. So,
right.
Man, I really appreciate your time. I really value your insight, especially when it comes to eating and how we can do this realistically with our kids and kind of leave a legacy of long life and health and vitality in a way that's pretty simplistic.
Right. Yeah. Right. It really is. I mean, it can get complex, but I think if we tackle these big picture things of making them aware of consequences and empowering them with additive approaches, mainly like add protein, add good foods. So don't worry so much. And that will displace the other things instead of like being the extractive, methods. I think that works, and it takes time, and it doesn't need to be generally 100% perfect to be really effective. If the kids have type 1 diabetes or like gluten intolerance or something like that, then yeah, you have to be on point. Otherwise, there's really terrible health consequences there, and that's a kind of a different conversation. But yeah, it's a lot of work in the beginning, but once you start getting some habits established, it's really not that hard. It's not that crazy. I don't think you're going to cause disordered eating in your kids and whatnot. And that's just awesome. One day at a time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the complicated and making it less complicated for some of us simpletons, or I won't say simpletons, people who aren't research biochemists. It's like, that's not in our nature. So it's really nice to have someone kind of bring it to the level where we can understand and actually implement things that make sense.
Oh, thanks. I mean, when my network goes down, my computer guy doesn't go into deep detail about, information theory and, packet information bundles. He's like, plug this thing into that and reset this. And, there you go. So we can't be experts in everything, but this is where I think a community like what you have built is awesome, because you get some different subject matter experts. And if that person gives you information that you can trust, and it's kind of, we always reserve some credulity around things. But if the person has given you consistently good information, then it's like, I don't need to do a full, Jason Bourne vetting on this process. It's like, right. I can trust this exactly. 85, 90%, as long as it makes sense, as long as it's continuing to deliver the goods, then that's all well and good.
Yeah. Well, for listeners, if you haven't done so, go pick up the Paleo solution. I'm sure it's on Amazon. Wired to Eat, and then also the newer one, Sacred Cow, which he co-authored with Diana Rogers, and then you have a community. Just give that one a shout out real quick.
Yeah, it's just called The Healthy Rebellion, and so if you search Healthy Rebellion and Healthy Rebellion Radio, that's the podcast that I do with my wife around that. Yep,
that's awesome. And then what I'll do is I'll put all that stuff in the show notes. So for you listeners, you got to check out Robb. I mean, many of you have already probably tuned into some of his stuff. Good for you. If you haven't, it's time to do it, because it's really changed the way I see nutrition, and it's made a big difference in my life. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Brotherhood of Fatherhood. If you are a dude, you can join our Facebook group if you're kind of into that thing. If you're not, you can follow us on Instagram, Brotherhood of Fatherhood. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Robb.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brotherhood of Fatherhood podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to share it with your friends, your family, and follow us on social media. If you are a father, make sure you join our Facebook group, the Brotherhood of Fatherhood. Hit the subscribe button and tune in next time for more podcasts from the Brotherhood of Fatherhood.